daily assignments. And then increase that. And then you're going to get a paper on Friday. So just be ready for that as we go. It will be a pretty extensive paper. I've got a rubric started. I'm working on trying to make sure that I get everything to you. You get a week to write it. So just sort of be prepared for that as we go. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about interest groups. Before we talk about interest groups and social movements, we need to kind of talk about some of the common phrases, words, terms that you hear in the world of interest groups. Okay, this is my big appeal. Please, please, please know the terms for this chapter. This is the chapter where most people use the terms incorrectly. And if you use the terms incorrectly, it's going to be very obvious to the reader. It's also going to really hurt you in the multiple choice. So make sure that you know exactly what a lobbyist is, exactly what a political action committee is, all of those things. Make sure that you really got the terms nailed in this chapter. Okay, so what is an interest group? It's an organized group of individuals who share common objectives and actively attempt to influence lobby or policymakers. So this is really important. An interest group is more than just a club, it's more than just a meeting. The point of an interest group is to influence government, okay? It's not just people getting together. So 4-H is not an interest group on your local level because it doesn't have anything to do with government, okay? Clubs at school obviously aren't interest groups. What makes it an interest group is when they're actually influencing or attempting to influence the public or government in specific. Now, one of the ways that they do this is they hire a lobbyist. What is a lobbyist? This is a person, an individual typically, they come from organizations or firms often, who attempt to influence legislation and other administrative decisions in government. So a lobbyist is an actual person who is hired by the interest group to be the connector between the interest group and government. It's the middleman. And we use lobbyists for 2 different reasons. Number 1, we use a lobbyist so that one person goes to government and gives a collective voice rather than a bunch of different people going and saying different things. We use it sort of for a collective voice, but we also use it for a second reason, which is really important. And that's that they bring information back to the interest group. It's the one thing we don't talk about very often when we talk about lobbying, but lobbyists also come back to the interest group and say, here's what's happening. So I'll give you an example. Last year I was talking to Ms. Jensen in a meeting about all of the things that superintendents have to know about. Because to me it feels like a lot. They have to know about per pupil money, they have to know about new standards, they have to know about mandates that come down, they have to know about things like the citizenship test, they have to know about all of those very specific things. And she said, well, we have a lobbyist for that. Essentially what she is a part of is a group of superintendents in the state of Wisconsin who are a collective interest group, and what they did is they hired a lobbyist. That lobbyist's number 1 job is to send the information from the superintendents to the government. So if all of Wisconsin superintendents are saying something about a specific issue, the lobbyist is going to go to government and explain that to them. But the other thing that the lobbyist does is takes information from government and brings it back to the superintendents. And that lobbyist does that in plain English. That lobbyist will explain, here's the new test that's coming to you. Here's the new mandate. Here's the new type of funding you're going to get next year. So that there's one voice coming to a superintendent with all that information rather than a bunch of different voices. So a lobbyist works both ways. It's pretty important. Okay, poll data shows that more than 2/3 of all Americans belong to at least one interest group or association. 2/3 of all Americans. You tend to be a part of interest groups even without consciously knowing it. If you're a part of a professional community, if you have some sort of insurance, typically you're a part of some sort of interest group or association. Interest groups range from as small as local environmental organizations, things like your local community organization that cleans up lakes and rivers in your area, to as large as national organizations that can have upwards to 10, 15, 20 million members. So it kind of has this huge range of options for you. And they have pros and cons for each. There are some definite pros to being in a local interest group. There are some definite cons. And part of a national interest group definitely has some benefits to you, but it also has some problems that come along with that as well. We'll talk a little bit about that as we get going a little further into this. So interest groups and social movements. What we've noticed, what we see is tending to happen is that interest groups come out of social movements. Obviously, a social movement is where a large group of people have an issue or an idea or a problem or a voice, and they need an interest group to sort of be the government side of that. And so we tend to see some pretty big interest groups come out of social movements. Organizations like the National Organization of Women, we call it NOW, came out of the women's movement. The NAACP came out of the civil rights movement. When we see big social movements start to happen, we start to see interest groups emerge to sort of do the government side of that issue. Why are there so many? There are a number of reasons why interest groups are growing. The number one thing is what we call in government pressure points, that the government has a lot of pressure points, meaning that there are a lot of people to influence. You have 535 people in the legislative branch. You've got the executive branch with all of their bureaucracy and organizations and cabinet positions and all of those things. You've got the judicial system that ranges from a local judicial court to the Supreme Court. There are a lot of areas where people can influence government. So when you have a lot of that, you need a lot of interest groups. You need a lot of groups that can kind of do that. The other reason is that we see new technologies. We see new issues in government that we didn't see before. And that causes an interest group to emerge. I wouldn't be surprised if in the next 3 to 5 years we start to see interest groups that are very specifically geared towards the idea of racial minorities and law enforcement. It's becoming a social movement. It's becoming an issue in our public life, our public policy. I wouldn't be surprised if you start to see an interest group emerge. That wouldn't have been a thing 10 years ago. Cell phones, computers, data security, credit cards, all of those things are becoming more and more prevalent, meaning that interest groups need to have more and more movement. And then the third reason why there are so many is because interest groups are really successful. Historically, they've been very successful in getting legislation passed, in getting their message out, and sort of helping their cause further to a point where it can be pretty powerful. The other thing that we need to make sure that we understand here is that there are interest groups in our country because of the First Amendment. It's what allows you to be a part of an interest group. You have the right to assemble, and you have the right to free speech. Interest groups are not everywhere. Sometimes in countries, if you were involved in an interest group, you would be breaking the law. So you have to understand that interest groups are very unique to our country because we have this First Amendment that allows you to do that. You are protected by law to become part of an interest group. I couldn't get fired for becoming a part of an interest group. I couldn't be discriminated against. I couldn't be put in jail for being a part of an interest group because it's part of my First Amendment right. The only way that I could is if it would be a danger to somebody else. And we'll kind of talk about that next week about what makes an interest group an interest group. Is the KKK an interest group? It sort of depends on your idea of the betterment of public or public good. So we'll talk about that next week. A couple of other ones that I didn't mention, the Human Rights Campaign, the Urban League, the National Gay and Lesbian Task Force came out of the LGBT struggle for rights. The League of United Latin American Citizens came out of the Chicano movement. So lots of different things coming out of the big social movements that we've seen in American history. One of the things that I would highly recommend to you is to take this week and every night, go and look at one of these interest groups. Learn about them, get on their websites, figure out what they're about. A lot of you, and I'll pass these back later, in your FRQ analysis of what are you doing well and what do you want to work on, a lot of you, for the thing you want to work on was being more specific, using more specific examples. This is it. When there's an FRQ that asks you about interest groups and you can basically tie it to a very specific interest group, you're showing really good knowledge. The other thing that I'll mention here is this morning I went through all of the FRQs from 1999 to 2002. There were 5 that specifically talked about interest groups. 3 of the 5 actually had in the FRQ a question relating to a very specific interest group. They said something like, please explain how the NRA uses its, social grassroots movement, blah, blah, blah. They actually cited a very specific interest group. So it's important that you know some of these really big ones. It's important that you're kind of read up on them, that you know what the NAACP does, that you know what NOW does and what their message is and things like that. It might be helpful to you to be more specific. Obviously, I can't get into all the specifics of these because I don't have time. So it might be something that you want to do every night this week, is just to sort of learn about at least one every night. Okay, incentives. There's a couple of things I need to get to before we talk about incentives, because there are a couple of reasons why there are incentives. Number one is an issue called latent interests. This is where public policy interests are not recognized or addressed by a group at a particular time. So we know that there are a lot of latent interests in our public policy, things that we don't have a group for yet. Things that are becoming issues that we don't really have a group for. And we might see an interest group emerge, but the other thing you have to realize is that interest groups are really difficult to get off the ground. It's this idea of trying to communicate with people across the country, across different languages and cultures and things like that. And then the second issue that we need to talk about before we talk about incentives is called the free rider problem. We're starting to see this become a bigger problem with your generation. Essentially what a free rider problem is where people are using the materials, the ideas, the information from an interest group without becoming a part of the interest group. So you're sort of free riding. You're using what they give out, but you're not becoming a part of their organization. I'll give you an example. I am not a part of the National Education Association. It's the largest interest group for teachers. The NEA does all sorts of things for teachers. It's also sometimes kind of used as, I'm an NEA teacher, I'm a part of this professional group. I'm not a part of that group. However, I use the NEA website all the time. The NEA website has conferences that are coming up in my area, has books that I could read for professional development, has lesson plans, has news articles, and has a specific section of the rights in the laws that I have as a teacher. I'm using all of their information, but I am not a part of their interest group. I'm a free rider. And this becomes a problem when more and more people become free riders, because interest groups need numbers. They need people to be a part of their group to be as powerful as they want to be. And when you're not, you're obviously damaging that a little bit. What we're seeing is that your generation is a lot more of this free rider because you know how to use technology to get what you need without having to be a part of the group. And we know that interest groups don't want to shut down the things that they give out because they're hoping that it'll entice you enough to be a part of the interest group. Okay, so incentives. How are interest groups trying to get more and more membership? It's a pretty big issue. There are 3 specific incentive ideas here. You need to know these terms, okay? Please make sure that you know, and if you're using this in an FRQ, you refer to it as a solidarity incentive. Solidarity sounds like solidarity. It's the idea of companionship. Interest groups will use this as an incentive to bring people into their interest group, and the idea that you can be a part of a group that shares the same idea as you do. Many people join interest groups because they just want to be a part of a community of people who have the same ideas and values. So the example that your book gives is the National Audubon Society. The National Audubon Society was originally founded to protect a specific type of bird that was about to become extinct. As they've evolved, it's now become this bigger organization that sort of involves people who are interested in bird watching and bird species and in the environmental movement. They've been able to make their organization a solidarity incentive program. The idea that most people who sign up for the Audubon Society are just interested in becoming a part of a community of people who have the same interests as they do. This idea that you can share thoughts and ideas. One of the other interest groups that does this a lot is MAD, Mothers Against Drunk Driving. We know that when people are in grief, when they feel like they've been wronged, they want to find people who have shared the same experience. And Mothers Against Drunk Driving does that. They're obviously very involved in litigation as far as drunk driving offenses, but one of the major things here is just bringing people who have, been traumatized or hurt or have, gone through some struggles to be able to come together and sort of have some community in that. Material incentives, things like, down to keychains, bumper stickers, calendars, things like that. Lots of people will sign up for interest groups simply for the materials, but they can also go beyond that. And one of the major interest groups that does this is the AARP. This is the Association of American Retired Peoples, or American Association of Retired Peoples. They provide things like discounts. If you are an AARP member, you tend to get discounts. You have to be a retired person or above a specific age to be a part of the AARP. They also provide insurance, car insurance, to their members. If you'd like to buy insurance from their organization, you can do that. They organize travel opportunities for their members. You can travel. AARP will typically do a cruise or something like that, and you can go through them and get a discount. It's a pretty important thing. In fact, the AARP is probably one of the best interest groups in being able to do these things. For instance, this last week I was with one of my good friends who is in his late 20s, and he has a credit card from the AARP. Well, he's not retired and he's not in the AARP, but they have now extended their material incentives to people who aren't in their retired group, in the idea that hopefully he'll become a part of the AARP if he's been using their credit card company for so many years, using all of their benefits. So they're finding a way to get those material incentives to their members, their future members, to keep their membership up. It's brilliant. It's a super smart idea. And then purposive incentives. This is just the general idea that we know people will often join interest groups just for the purpose of seeing some change. That they want to be involved in making change, in making sure something changes. The environmental movement uses purposive incentives a lot. This idea that we need to come together to see some change here. We need to see some issues being brought up in government around climate change and the environmental movement. And they appeal to future members in that way, to sort of say, if you want to be a part of this, join our interest group and we can sort of become some change in government taking action. Okay, types of interest groups. So we will, typically people split interest groups into different genres. And so one of the big ones here is economic interest groups. Economic interest group is the biggest genre. We see a lot of interest groups in economic interest groups. The number one here is business interest groups. This would be like the National Association of Manufacturers. That's an example for you. They're likely to agree on anything that reduces the government oversight in business. So business interest groups' main goal is to make sure that the government doesn't get too involved, that this idea of free trade will continue to flourish, that the more government gets involved in business regulation and taxation and tariffs and things like that, the less productive a business can be. So their main idea is to try and keep government out of there. The next one is agricultural interest groups. This is one of the largest segments of interest groups that we have. And there are two main organizations in the agricultural interest group industry. Number one is the American Farm Bureau Federation. It has several million members. It publishes things like farm statistics, prices on goods. It organizes farmers in making sure that agricultural prices stay at a level where they can make a living. The second agricultural interest group that's huge is the National Farmers Union. And this has emerged in the last 10, 20 years. It's an organization of small farmers. What we started to see is small family farms are being bought up by these big corporations or big corporate farms. And so the small family farms joined together to make the National Farmers Union to sort of make sure that those small family farms still have a voice, to make sure that they're given things that they need that maybe they wouldn't normally get on their own. Next is labor interest groups. This is probably one of the most important interest groups for you, that if you become a professional, you'll often be asked to be in the labor union. There's a union of teachers here in our school district. There are also many labor unions that are bigger that you can be a part of. The biggest labor union is the AFL-CIO. You need to know the AFL-CIO. It's huge. It's the biggest labor interest group in the United States. We start to see labor and service sector people use the unions a lot because they are a group of people and then they negotiate with their supervisors or their higher ups to decide wages, decide benefits, to decide worker compensation, things like that. You aren't required to be a part of a labor union. In fact, earlier in our history, when labor unions had first emerged, if you were a part of a labor union, oftentimes your boss would not treat you as well. Because management typically doesn't love labor unions because they're constantly asking for more. And they're a voice that they can't really ignore, because typically if a labor union is most of the workers in your factory, you need to be able to listen to what they need. Public employee unions. These are people who work for the government, the city. They are people like me, teachers, police officers, firefighters, people who work in mass transit, people who drive the metro buses, people who work at the courthouse, city hall, things like that. Public employee unions, your book is actually going to specifically mention Wisconsin. Public employee unions in Wisconsin have gone down dramatically in the last 3 to 4 years, and that's essentially out of Act 10. So Act 10 was a piece of legislation that was passed a number of years ago, and it restricts public employee unions from being able to do what we call collective bargaining. What that means is that if I was a part of my labor union here at the school, they can't go, what they would typically have done in years past, is when there's negotiations on salary, how much I'll make next year, the union would send a representative to those negotiations, and that representative would speak on behalf of all of the people in the union. They're not allowed to do that anymore. They can go to the meeting, but they can't negotiate. They're not allowed to collectively bargain. And so essentially what happens is that your management, your boss in the public sector, says, this is what I'm paying the employees next year. And the union has to nod their head and say yes. There's really nothing they can do. And so we've seen public employee unions go way down because there's really no point in becoming a part of the union when there's really nothing that the union is allowed to do. And so it's become a pretty big issue, especially in the state of Wisconsin, as far as union membership goes. Interest groups for professionals. These are things like the Bar Association, the Association of General Contractors of America, the Institute of Electrical or Electronic Engineers. If you're in a professional job, if you're a doctor, a lawyer, a architect, you know, whatever, typically there's a professional interest group for you. And a lot of times you'll become a part of that interest group just for the idea that you're developing professionally, that you can contact the people in that interest group, get ideas, share ideas, get information about things that you might need to know as part of your professional life, things like that. And then the last piece that we haven't really talked about is, what about people who are considered low, lower middle class to low class in an socioeconomic status? What happens to the unorganized poor? Well, essentially, they don't have a lot of interest groups. We know that organized people or groups in the population, such as non-English speaking people, resident aliens, so people who are here on visas, single parents, disabled Americans, younger voters. We don't have a lot of interest groups. We don't have a lot of places for you to participate in government. And that's for a number of reasons. Number one, unorganized poor don't have money to devote to an interest group. And if they don't have money to devote to an interest group, the interest group can't grow and live. You can't pay someone to lobby for an interest group with no money. So we see that interest groups are really built for people who are in upper middle class to upper class. It's going to become an issue here because if the people who are trying to influence policymakers are all from a specific socioeconomic status, those who are not in that socioeconomic status do not have any influence in government. Therefore, there is no legislation written for them. There is no voice for them in government. It becomes a problem. We also know that on the flip side of that, unorganized sport don't have a lot of time to devote to an interest group. Single parents, young people, they typically don't get involved in interest groups because it's just not a piece of your time. The number one reason why the AARP is one of the largest interest groups is because retired people have time to get devoted into their government. They have time to care about the issues. They need government for a lot of things. So the thing that you need to recognize here is that interest groups are something that was made for our government for a specific group of people. And there's a very large population of people that don't have anything to do with interest groups. Interest groups are not a valid representation of our population. Okay. This is the graph that is in your book that you can take a look at. This is a picture that's also in your book. It's kind of showing you what the power of an interest group or a labor union, which is considered an interest group, can be. If you've ever traveled in the San Francisco area, they have a public transport system called the BART. It's called the Bay Area Rapid Transit System. It's extensive. The BART is a subway system. It's also a bus system. It's also a train system. It's all the BART system. If you ever travel in San Francisco, you typically use at least one or two by the time you're done with your visit. In 2013, all of the service sector people, all the people who worked for the BART system that were in the union, decided to strike, decided to not go to work. It shut down the city. It's a powerful message. It's saying we need some changes. We aren't going to work until we see those changes, and it brings people to the negotiating table really quickly. City officials do not want their city to be sitting empty like this, so they get to the table and they try and make an agreement with that union. So it's allowing you to understand the power of being a part of a community. Your generation typically doesn't get into labor unions. It's just kind of a generational thing that's been happening. My grandparents wouldn't have thought of anything other than being in a labor union. It was huge because there's some power in being in a group of people that you work with. Okay, a couple of more before we finish today. Environmental groups, there are a lot. There are environmental groups that are specific to a specific species of animal or a specific kind of pollution in our environment, to as large as global environmental organizations. This week in France, there's a huge climate change summit, basically a big conference of nations coming together to talk about climate change. I wouldn't be surprised if you see some of these environmental organizations, interest groups, start to publish things in the news in the next few days to sort of bring to light some of the issues going on. They're going to use that conference as sort of a platform to bring some issues to the mass media. Public interest groups, these aren't specific to any specific issue. They're kind of for the betterment of the nation, for the betterment of people. They're very broad-reaching. Ralph Nader is probably the biggest name in a public interest group segment. He's devoted a ton of his own income to about 60 organizations that he's either formed or sponsored. He also ran as a third-party candidate for president a number of years ago. Some other public interest groups would be an organization called Common Cause. They move national priorities towards the public, making government institutions more responsive. So we see public interest groups that just their general purpose is to bring information from the government to you. We have what we call the Government Accountability Board in Wisconsin. And essentially their job is to publish what's happening in government every day. For you to understand if there's something that's not quite right that's happening in government. Their main idea is that you should be more aware of what happens day to day in government. Other interest groups, there are single interest groups, things like the NRA, the National Rifle Association, is a single interest group. They have a very single focused mindset. They tend to attract people simply for the idea that they enjoy or participate in a specific event or idea. Single interest groups are pretty popular. And then the last piece here is foreign governments. Foreign governments have realized that in order for there to be some influence in government in another area, rather than just treaties and other communications, they've realized that if they form interest groups and put those interest lobbyists into our government, they can often get some things as well. So what we tend to see is foreign governments hire former representatives or former senators, so people who used to work in Congress. They'll hire them to lobby for their country or their interests in our government. So these are things like trade agreements, taxation, things like that, that foreign governments are actually represented in the lobbying form, that you'll see lobbyists out on Capitol Hill that are specifically just representing a country to try and make sure that those things that the country cares about are involved in our government system. It's a very interesting piece of the interest group area. Okay, you are finished with notes for today. We will finish, hopefully we'll finish the rest of them tomorrow.